Welcome to Bleach Revisited. This is episode 6, where we'll be reading the 6th chapter of Bleach. As always, these videos are unscripted and divided into 3 parts: a reading, an analysis and response, and talking about the foreshadowing, how it connects to the larger part. You can find the timestamps for those different parts in the description or in the video timeline, provided YouTube doesn't change that feature between me recording this and you watching it. Regardless, let's get this started. I've already read through this chapter before on my initial reading of Bleach, and earlier today as I ran into video issues with this chapter. But I will say, in revisiting it, it did make me tear up. It's a pretty good chapter. I do like it, so I'm excited to revisit it here with you in mind. Talk about it a little bit. So this is chapter 6, Micro Crack. When I was 15, my sister was born. She was more like a daughter to me than a sister. Our parents were truer monsters than I am now, the kind of monsters who would silence a baby's cry with beatings. I hid her, quieted her cries where they wouldn't hear. In March, when I was 18, I took my 3-year-old sister and fled that cursed house. After that, it was us against the world. Just the two of us, forever. I raised Orihime. I protected her. She's mine. Nobody else can have her. Least of all you, Ichigo Kurosaki. You will never have her. Sora! As if, Captain Overbite, Orihime doesn't belong to anyone. She's mine. Her soul is mine. I lived for her, but she won't live for me. Very well. Then she will die for me. No. Bleach. Chapter 6. Micro Crack. Orihime. Orihime. I'm sorry, Sora. I wanted to share them. Fun things at school, the happy stuff, things I liked, people I liked. At first, all I did was pray every day, but I thought that was wrong. I didn't want you to see my sadness. I didn't want you to feel my pain. So I hid it from you. I only shared my happiness with you, so you wouldn't suffer for me. I didn't realize it made you feel lonely. I had no idea. Sora, I'm sorry I hurt you. I love you. Orihime! It's not too late. She could still be saved. Rukia, the Inga no Kusari, the chain of fate, is still attached. As long as it's connected to her body, she isn't really dead. I can use my Kido to save her. Orihime, sister. You're in my way. Step back. Orihime, I knew that you stopped praying so you wouldn't worry me, but I didn't want you to stop. When you were praying, your heart was all mine. What are you looking at? That hairpin, that was a gift from you, she told me. It was the first gift that you ever gave her. She still wears it every day. It's the same. Those who die and those that get left behind, they all feel alone. You were so caught up in your own loneliness, you forgot about hers. I didn't know. The hairpin, I thought she threw it away. Hey, what are you... Why did you do it? It's alright. If I stayed as I am, I'd lose myself again and attack Orihime. That's why, now, in this moment of sanity, I want to pass on. But why? You don't... Ichigo! His decision is right. Hollows can never go back. Let him pass on. Rukia, it's all right. To reap hollows is not really to kill them. Reaping merely frees them of sin. Then Zanpakuto cleanses them so they can enter soul society. That is the reason soul reapers exist. Then, goodbye, Orihime. Sora, there's something I always wanted to tell you. The hairpin you gave me, I never really liked it. We had a fight that day, and for the first time, we ate dinner without speaking, and I sat facing the wall all evening. Then, you went off to work the next day. I let you go without saying a word. Why did it have to be that day? Maybe it wouldn't have made any difference, but I've always regretted not saying this. Sora, have a nice day. He's gone. Gone. Your wounds, they're better mostly. Anyway, they don't matter. I have tons of questions I want to ask you. Orihime, what do you do? Kyoku Chikan, memory replacement. I erased tonight from her memory and gave her substitute memories. We can't let people know about this. Kyoku Chikan? Yes. Only we can't choose the new memories. They're random. She probably didn't see anything, but just in case. Random? You'll see what I mean tomorrow. Ah! No! For real! A Yakuza gunman totally came in and, blasted a huge hole in my wall. Whatever, Space Girl. Orihime. That childlike mind of yours is really cute, Princess. It happened, didn't it, Tatsuki? Yeah. You saw it too, Tatsuki? Okay, I get it now. Uh-huh. You used it on my family the other day, huh? Yep, I did. It worked well, didn't it? That is it for Chapter 6 of Bleach. Let us return back to the beginning and we can hop straight back into analysis and response. I will say, even reading this for, I think, the fourth time now at least, still gets me. Still emotional. Here we start back a few pages before the drop there. Anyway, let's hop back right into the analysis and response to this. As always, this is a narrative and a visual analysis of what's going on, kind of my own response to. You get a little bit of how I personally feel about these things interspersed too. So don't take this as, law or whatnot. This is just kind of my take, and I'm interested in yours in the comments. So if there's anything that, you feel I left out, or you want to discuss any part of this, or you want to, bring your own context to it, that's the whole point of these videos. Anyway, let's get into that. The analysis and response portion for this video. So here we start with, I think, is a pretty effective panel where we just get the older Sora and his younger sister Orihime's hands. We really get the sense of that connection between the two of them. I think that's fantastic. We also get using those square boxes to kind of show what might be internal kind of dialogue. It's interesting because the way that this reads, especially with the next pages where he's yelling at Ichigo, we get this transition where I think the idea is that he is telling Ichigo this, right? But this isn't dialogue that exists in these flashbacks. So we're supposed to be reading this as kind of narration towards us, and then it's a surprise whenever it becomes dialogue as we're grounded back in that other scene. It's a curious way to do it, but I think it works. It certainly doesn't read awkwardly visually. But I do think about a lot about kind of lettering and the way that people use their letterboxing and things like that, because that has a significant effect on how you literally read the manga, right? It's not just the visuals, which that's the hope. And this first page is actually pretty visual light, but I think what it's doing is some kind of bigger things that I wish, a lot of, like I said in previous chapters, one of the criticisms I have for a lot of manga is whenever they start to get especially wordy, they can really shore up on using their visual language, and they become more novel-like, often using representative visuals instead of trying to use visuals that drive the narrative. It's instead visuals that supplement like literal like text, which I don't think is. I think that's completely beside the point for manga, right? The manga should be like a visual medium. It should be taking advantage of that. Comics in general should take advantage of the fact that it's the medium, right? Literally any content should take advantage of. It's a medium. And so if it's not doing that, the content isn't really actualized. I can get a lot into that. That's pretty much one of the big focus of my studies whenever I finally ended up in college, right? So huge thing for me is kind of how media gets used and the sort of rhetoric of the media. And by media I mean like the medium something is transmitted in. Anyway, so what I'm saying that's effective here, why this still kind of ends up being visually forward, is as we're clearly caught in reading this background, and the visuals kind of take a back a step back. Here we have a pretty strong starting visual, but it clearly roots us somewhere that's not present, right? Especially coming from the last chapter. And we have very vague visuals of like a time that's passed, and then we get this all white panel, which usually I hate this. I can't stand whenever mangaka do the all white panel of nothing but text. It usually strikes me as the lamest thing that you could do. But here I think it actually serves a really strong purpose, because it helps, one, transition from this all black starting panel. So we're moving from this kind of black to white to like a present. But also it provides us with this clean slate where we're just thinking about that dialogue before we jump back in scene in the next page. And so immediately we're back in scene. So we go, I think that white panel there helps transition and clear the slate of the flashback visual without having to use the previous kind of used flashback visuals of having like the static outlines between the panels. Which we do see later in this chapter with Orihime's flashback. But I think it serves there, like I said, a pretty strong indicator of moving between those two moments in time and focusing, especially like I said, on that dialogue transition. That's the moment that's leaking us between like this kind of flashback moment to currently what's happening. Also, again, we get that kind of less detail on Ichigo. Because I'm zoomed in on my reader, it's a lot easier to kind of notice. If you're looking at like a full page like you normally would, this is a much smaller figure, right? So it's a lot easier to have that, that depth of field effect. And again, we can see pretty effective kind of use of, here I talked about lettering earlier and using the text boxes. Normally we read left to right to left, right, for manga. So we're going to follow this through this kind of image here, and then we're going to go back down here. And here, the dialogue helps us kind of flow our eye through these panels, and then these are linked to bring us down here to kind of naturally read this left to right to get this, like finally getting Ichigo's expression, which we didn't get earlier. So I like that it does get filled in, that we do get to see a little bit of how he's reacting to this. And then, wouldn't classic setup and then delivery into a right-left action shot, punctuated by the text that, literally is roaring us across the screen. So, again, Kubo having this really, at least strong sense of like the core mechanics of how to present kind of interesting manga here. And even though it doesn't make sense in scene, because we have Orihime, she's to the left here, and then we are presented maybe from Ichigo's perspective, her being on the right, but also Acid Ringer on the right because he really is. So perspective doesn't make as much sense, but Orihime at least is set left here, but then very cleverly used again right to left. That kind of action reads clearer than having her come the other way, especially with this top composition. Anyway, a great middle panel of this block, um, of this exchange. You'll see a lot of the times whenever there's a panel in the middle of a larger page used for action that it will be often this meeting of two characters. So usual, like the spring, the start of an action will happen, and then if the action continues on to the next panel, if it hasn't connected there, you'll see a lot of the time this full middle space used pretty effectively to show that clash. Um, yeah, I'm just thinking of some of the later compositions in Bleach that are really striking me, and yeah, Kubo really definitely develops his artistic style in a lot of ways, but these fundamentals, I think, continue to stay throughout. One of the things that I'm really curious about that I kind of always, it's easy to forget about or not think about are all these sound effects and how those get, interpreted, like this like huge roar cutting across and kind of helping our eye flow from the one figure to the other, as well as this chunk, right? So I'm curious how much of that sticks around in later Bleach, because I don't remember it, but it's one of those things that's easy to kind of forget about in manga, right? Like how the sound effects get visually used. But in early Bleach, you see a lot of that, a lot of the sound effects being like a kind of very visual part of the language of the series, the visual language of the series, I mean. So it's neat. I also like here that Ichigo's refutation of all of that is that Orihime doesn't belong to anyone. I think that's a fantastic, like that's very in line with Ichigo's thinking, where he really prizes individuality and the individual as like the most kind of important self, right? At the very least for himself he does. But here we get where he's really kind of putting that on others as well. Like while they might have these duties and might have these connections to other people that like are important, he still is saying like Orihime doesn't belong to anyone because it's not this sort of battle between. And I love this, that it's not this battle between these two masculine figures over who owns this person's affection or them or whatever. But instead that Ichigo is decidedly in the camp that like, no, that's for her to decide. Like that's not something that either of us gets to decide. Like the way that she lives her life is her own. And I love again that like that is 100% in line with Ichigo, and I think also works really well here for this conflict. Um, as always, kind of one of the things that I will be trying to track, especially throughout as we get more and more kind of morally complex antagonists, is the ways in which their ideals conflict with our protagonists. And so, I mean, so stories, I guess, to take a step back, stories literally exist in conflict. Like, if there isn't a conflict, there really isn't a story. I mean, yeah, you can tell someone things that happened in sequence, but like that's not interesting. Like, what makes and maybe that's more accurate. Is like what makes an interesting story is some sort of conflict. And that conflict can take any number of forms. Obviously, this is a battle manga. We pit these characters against each other. But I think what makes that conflict interesting, and this is again in any story, is whenever the things that are in conflict both have a reasonable goal that they want to achieve, be it like two individuals or an individual versus a society or an individual with different thoughts, whatever it may be. Whenever the different agents that are affecting this conflict, whenever both of them have a goal that is like something that you can actually sympathize with, or at least, see as reasonable, that's whenever it becomes a much more interesting conflict, because it's like, oh, well, I kind of want, I'm interested to see who wins this, because they both have things that they want, right? And so, more than if Acid Wire were just a normal Hollow attacking Orihime, or even if he was her brother, but we didn't get so much of this internalization and so much of this human element from him, then we wouldn't get as rich a conflict there. Like, it would just be like, okay, well, he wants to eat her, whatever. Like, that feels less organic, or at least less substantive, than something that we can actually relate to. Because, I mean, hopefully, if you're watching this, you don't eat people. Um, but maybe you have felt protective of somebody. Maybe you have felt like, you didn't want to give somebody up to somebody else, especially. So, like, I think, that's relatable to a degree. Obviously, not to the extremes that Aswire's at, but I think that's important. And we'll see more of that as we continue in Bleach, where we'll have these characters in conflict for different reasons. And yeah, a lot of the time, Ichigo is going to be the character that we root for, and that will feel like the moral kind of anchor to all of this, the character that we can relate to the most because he's our protagonist. Um, if another character feels more right than Ichigo, and Ichigo, comes into conflict with them, then that becomes a little bit more difficult for us to root for our protagonist. And while that's certainly a viable story and would be interesting, that's not necessarily always what's going to happen in a straight up and down, battle series. So we'll see, of course, if that does come to pass. But I do like that here we already have this establishment of, conflicting ideals as well as personages on like one page. Like we have the physicality of these characters clashing as well as, where they are kind of mentally. And I love that it gets kind of reflected here where he's yelling to Ichigo that, like, that he'll never have her, that she's his, right? And even here in these two panels, like, we get that back and forth. So we have a couple of different ways that our characters can clash, not just physically, but ideologically as well. Um, and I think that's more compelling. That's more interesting, right? But yeah. Uh, this kind of, and then we see that twisted with Sora, where she's not going to live for him, then she'll die for him, right? Which messed up. Here again, we see Ichigo not being as proficient as he should be, right? He should have at the time struck him head on and killed him. Still should have maybe even done that before, but here he gets swatted away, and that's what causes Asawire to be able to hit Orihime. And I love that, there we get that close in, that action. Ichigo, trying to stop it, yelling no, but can't, just those two panels and that evocative kind of schmop, chomp, actually. Uh, and then the break to the actual cover page, I think builds like an interesting moment of tension where we're left wondering, okay, what happened? And then we get this, this kind of absolvement from Orihime, where she's really accepted her brother, even monstrous as he may be, right? And yeah, that kind of apology there from her. I think this is a great character building moment for Orihime, who before we could maybe write off as being, like shy, but a little like ditzy or airheaded or goofy or whatever, right? But here we get like a level of emotional maturity to her that we haven't quite seen yet, where she has this kind of understanding of like, well, she didn't want to share these sadder things with like her brother, even though she understood that like he was dead. She didn't really think that he was like literally an entity standing over her, right? But she didn't want to feel that pain, that like Orihime has decided to live a happier life than what she's come from, and that she wants to project that kind of happiness and the enjoyable things that she's kind of immersing herself in, right? Her friends, the fun things at school, the things and people she likes. I like that here, whenever we get people that she likes, we both get to see Ichigo and Tatsuki, not just as kind of like reactions, but also as indicators of like, hey, look, she has these bonds. Again, you'll hear me say bonds like 1,000 times throughout Bleach Revisited. It's because the connections people make to each other are important, which that's a trope in a lot of shonen manga, but I think in Bleach it feels a little bit more earnest, or at least honest. Like I say earnest, more honest. Um, because in those other series, I'm quick to relate to the contemporary of the big three, Ichigo to Naruto and Luffy, right? Where like I think in One Piece, maybe building the cast and the crew and like having the Nakama on the boat, I think that's a little bit more, you know, like reasonable, even though it is steeped in this kind of fantasy adventure. Um, but with Naruto, it's kind of hard because a lot of that first plot before we get to Shippuden revolves around, the character of Naruto really like insisting upon being friends with the character of Sasuke. And I don't know, it doesn't really come across as earned, if that makes sense. Um, that like we don't get to see enough time of those characters actually coming to form like an understanding and relationship with each other that is completely reciprocal and representative of like actual friendship or the deep connection that would make somebody want to die for someone else, right? But here, I think the sorts of bonds that these characters have in Bleach tend to be a lot more one grounded because we literally have these characters that are going to school that are making friends and things naturally. But then also we get to see a lot of like much more rational emphasis on those bonds. So it's not like Orihime is saying like I want to die for these people that I connected to at school. She's just like, well, yeah, I started connecting to these other people and I wanted to share that I was close to them. Like I wanted to share the fun that I was starting to have and like my life was starting to turn better. I didn't realize that would make you feel lonely. And so like I think this does not just a great job of establishing like, hey, things that are important in this manga is like this greater depth of these characters, right? But also and like this emotional sincerity that they have, but also these connections that they've made that feel at least a little more realistic, less forced for the sake of the plot, right? They feel organically kind of forged within the narrative rather than kind of like I said forced because the characters need to be friends for the power of friendship to work, right? And I'll harp a lot on the power of friendship in shonen manga. It's often something that gets like reasonably kind of made fun of, or derided or whatever. I think Bleach does maybe one of the best jobs in any shonen manga on like actually representing the strength of being friends with someone or making those sorts of personal connections with another person and how that can really affect things. We'll see a lot of that throughout the manga, and I think here we start to see a little bit of that. How that like these connections that Orihime had, like sure she grew up in an abusive household. She had like her literally the only connection that she had to anybody was her brother, who then died. Um, who, if I did the math on that correctly, he raised her on his own for 9 years, like just on their own, which is kind of wild because they ran away. She was 3. I think he passed away whenever she was 12, and it's been 3 years since then. Now she's 15, like Ichigo, I assume. So about 9 years. Yeah, like that's insane. Like now being literally like growing up on your own because we don't get any other figure here that's kind of Orihime's guardian or anything. She's 15, going to high school, I guess. Um, but we do get that like she's made these connections with these people at school, and she's made these connections that are making her have like a better life, and that feels realistic, and we get to see that before she says it too. Like we get to see the sorts of connections that she has with Ichigo, and especially with Tatsuki, who we see her both at school and at home kind of connecting with. So really cool moment. Really informs a lot of what's going on there, and a lot of what we'll see more in Bleach. But here we also get that, Orihime, again, this kind of depth to her character that she wants to live this happier life, that she wants to share this happiness and wants to kind of maybe reject or hide these kind of more sorrowful things that like she does feel this kind of extreme depth of emotion, but she doesn't always show that. Like that's not, she'd rather put on a happy face. She'd rather choose to see and share those kind of happy things because that's the sort of life that she wants to live. Um, Whether or not that's like, entirely mature or not, I think that's still like a very positive outlook, and also gives her an amount of depth that she hasn't had until, pretty much this chapter, which, yeah. It's also like really heartfelt as she realizes, like, yeah, she didn't realize how lonely it had made him, how literally it had warped him, that she hadn't completely considered his situation, which, like, to a degree, I don't blame her. He's passed on, he's a spirit and everything. I think on the other hand, you can consider this as maybe saying, like, okay, well, you should still respect those who have passed on. But I think to a degree she has, right? Um, so I don't see this as completely a condemnation of turning your back on those who have passed away, or, like, the wishes or will of those that have passed away. Instead, I see it as kind of, the story is about how uh, like those lingering remnants can become twisted in different ways. Anyway, we can talk about that for days. We do get a little bit more kind of interesting depth here, where we learn that Orihime is not dead, that the chain of fate that is attached to her, which we've called attention to, because it's still attached, she isn't dead, and that Keto can be used to heal her. We get a surprisingly calm and lucid Acid Wire here. And we get yet more background on Orihime about the hairpin that she has, which has been an element of her design since she was introduced. It's pretty cool. Probably, I don't know how much of this is this story was planned from the get-go, or if that element of her design was already there and he wanted to do something kind of interesting with it. But neat bit of insight with Ichigo, where he's like, hey, look, those who die and those that get left behind, they all feel alone. I will always say, remember that Ichigo's grown up in this clinic. He's grown up around, families with people that have been dying and passing on. He's very familiar with death. So, like, this rings as kind of, again, him coming from his lived experience and of kind of experience being around a lot of people. But the other big thing is that you have to remember Ichigo's mother's been gone since he was really young, right? So, like, with his mother passed on, with her just memorialized in this big ridiculous portrait, uh, we kind of get, in those earlier chapters, Karen, was like, hey, take that down, right? We clearly get Ishin is still very in love with his wife, even though she's passed on. But here we get a little bit of that sentimentality from Ichigo finally as well, where he finally kind of, maybe in a way, is commenting on that like he's expressing that, maybe he was one of the ones left behind, that he felt alone as well. And, in a way, these connections are important to him too, because they're things that he's forged since then, perhaps, right? Or he makes a friend that he started to make since high school. So yeah, that idea of being so caught up in your own loneliness you forgot about someone else's, that sort of selfishness. And here he's really realizing, like, oh yeah, he's been entirely selfish in the way that he's been thinking about this. And this is a moment that I think gets depicted a little bit better in the anime than it here does in the manga. But, um, we don't really, kind of strange. We saw his hands both get cut off, but now he's got one again, which I don't think they cut off both the hands in the anime, both because it's a little censored, and then also because the scene makes a little less sense unless you just assume that he's regenerated in hand. But the idea is that he's reached out and grabbed Ichigo's Zenpakuto and stabbed himself in the face with it, right? It's weird because the grab action isn't ever really shown. Like, we get like this like kind of movement around that doesn't read entirely clear. Ichigo being confused, this loud cracking noise, and we see something draped over his sword. So it's supposed to be kind of us not aware of what's happening, and Ichigo sort of confused about it as well. But I don't know that the other panels quite sell it that much either. And the translation, also is intentionally maybe vague. I don't know if the dialogue originally, I assume, is that way too. Which maybe the idea is that you can't get away with a character stabbing themselves in the face, visually or explicitly stated. It's always framed here, outside of panel. But yeah, that's what's happening, is that he stabbed himself in his face. His mask is completely crumbled as he's run this sword through it. And that he's expressing, that if he stayed that same way, then he knows that he would eventually lose himself and lose his kind of sanity and attack her again. That like being a hollow means not having complete conscious control of the self. I like here, yeah, we are seeing, it's easy to miss, but Rukia did mention that she has keto that she can use to help heal Orihime and keep her alive. I do love that real early on we are shown that, like, okay, Shinigami can use these keto for binding, but they can also use them in these other ways too. So, I think one criticism that comes up a lot is that, Rukia gets, quote unquote sidelined, right? That she doesn't get a lot to do because she's, all of her powers Ichigo has them. So Ichigo is this male character with all this power, whereas the female character has to kind of take a backseat to that. And I don't feel as though that's fair towards the strength of the female characters in Bleach. Because certainly we get a lot of bravery and forwardness and emotional depth from Orihime here in this especially, but also like talking about like actual literal power and characters making do with what they can and all of that. I think Rukia still is very much like in control and very much expresses her strength in the ways that she can, even after Ichigo has this power of hers, right? Um, and here, like literally, she's still able to heal Orihime. She's still able to kind of direct things, and she's still this person that holds this information that's important, right? In a lot of ways, she's still in control of these sorts of situations. But yeah, I do like that Kido is shown. To get back to what I was saying, I like that Kido is shown as being multifaceted pretty early on, and that despite Ichigo maybe having Rukia's Soul Reaper power, she can still perform her Kido and still do things. Maybe her powers are starting to come back to her a little bit. That he hasn't taken completely 100% of everything and it's all gone. But yeah, here we learn quite a few important things. So one, Reaping Hollows doesn't kill them, it frees them with sin, and then they can go to Soul Society. So that's kind of a really, really kind of important part, obviously, of Bleach. I spoke to this before, but the idea of Bleach being like the purification of a thing, right? The cleansing of, black to white. So kind of evoking this idea of purification. But I also think that this speaks towards a larger sort of thematic thing that's going on in the manga, where it's less about just killing opponents, or less about like using force to stamp out like bad uses of force, if that makes sense. It's less about like, oh, that guy is bad, so we have to kill him, right? We have to be strong enough to put him down. Instead, there's this kind of like this restitution to it, or this idea that force isn't just used as a means for destroying other things, but instead of being able to help absolve others, or like help them beyond like their kind of antagonism, if that makes sense. So where other series might like kind of other series tend to, in other shonen manga, they tend to run this kind of like, oh, well, we'll befriend them versus we'll fight them versus we'll like defeat them kind of thing, right? And I think that sort of dynamic is still present in parts of Bleach. This idea of like, okay, kill, fights, and befriend, right? That's sort of the three-pronged way of dealing with conflict. But I think what makes Bleach a little more interesting is the idea that conflict can can be more than just, okay, whenever we go to fight somebody, it's not just to subjugate them, but instead it's us being able to purify the other person, right? It's us using our strength to kind of help absolve them, to help them move beyond being in this kind of tortured place. So that's interesting. I don't know. I'm interested in to hear like your thoughts on that too, because it's certainly unique. The idea of like you're going to use your strength to help these other things. Um, that like yeah, that conflict might be inevitable in some ways, and I think there's a certain maturity too to the idea that Bleach is not entirely pacifistic in the way that it's saying like, okay, look, there's going to be these forces out there that you're not going to get along with, that are going to want to hurt you or subjugate you or invoke their will upon you, and you're going to have to fight back. But fighting back doesn't mean destroying the other thing outright. It can often mean, kind of just having enough force to make things right. To essentially not bending their will to your own either. It's not like a manipulative thing, but it's like if there is something sinful or wrong about that antagonism, your force being strong enough to kind of to fight that, to repel that, and to make them see like the error of their ways, if that makes sense. Um, yeah, yeah, I don't know. It's interesting, but it's a through line throughout Bleach that a lot of the antagonists aren't going to just be these kind of outright bad mother effers that you have to kill. That instead it's going to be a lot more of this idea that through this sort of conflict, because of course there's going to be conflict. It's a battle manga. It's all about characters fighting each other. But like the fighting serves more of a purpose. And earlier we did talk about that it's like these ideologies that are clashing as well as these characters, which in any good battle manga that's the case as well. But it's pretty explicit in Bleach from the get go here. But that also, furthermore, here that like the means of battle is also towards like this ideological goal of absolving them, right? Rather than just killing them, like bringing an end to them. So that's interesting. The other really neat thing, the second thing, there's two things here that I said were really important or interesting, is that she says that's the reason that Soul Reapers exist, is so that they can cleanse hollows, right? And help them move to the Soul Society. So, earlier she said there were these two duties of Soul Reapers, right? They purify, or well, they vanquish hollows, which here we learn that they're really cleansing them, they're really reaping them, right? Which means cleansing them. And then also they help do the console kind of soul funeral to help the holes or the pluses, however you want to translate that, move on. But I like that here explicitly, Soul Reapers are tied to the existence of hollows. That hollows existing is the reason why Soul Reapers exist. That like purifying those hollows is the reason Soul Reapers exist, which is interesting. There's a lot of kind of different things that you can maybe think about with that, or takeaways you can take from it. But like the two are kind of intrinsically linked in that way, I think is kind of interesting and build for a neat mythology within the world. Yeah, just cool world building moment. Gives us a little bit to think about whenever it comes to Hollows. And yeah, this is the moment that always gets to me. Here is whenever Sora is finally saying goodbye to Orihime. Guess he's back to not having arms again. And we get that flashback here using, I think, because now we know that we're firmly in flashback land thanks to our scratchy backgrounds. We have that black box internalization. And clearly from Orihime's perspective here, starting from the black box of Sora there, right? But then, because we know that we're in flashback, the way that this is framed, so that we're not thinking that this is dialogue in flashback, but instead just more of those thoughts, is that instead of being put in those square boxes, it's just in these completely borderless text. And I think that's ultimately what Kubo ends up going with stylistically in the long run. But there's a good mix of a lot of different things, so it's interesting to track that. Um, but yeah, this idea that they had a fight, that then he got into this accident, which I assume is a car crash. I'm pretty sure, if not explicitly stated, that that's the case. But that she's always regretted not telling him to have a nice day. I think that's really sweet. That's a moment that really gets to me. Um, I think kind of tipping my personal hand here. I've kind of lived most of my life with family members that have been like terminally ill, and so this idea that they could be gone any day, and like that I might miss, that I might have a fight with them because, as it is with family, you're not always on the right terms. But that idea that any day could be the day that they pass away, and being really aware of their mortality, and that transience, and the idea that I might regret like having one of those moments. Maybe that's why this affects me a little bit more. Um, but even like into my adult life, where I've kind of lived more independently of my family, uh, and those certainly those people that have been affected have since passed away, and we have passed away. We've passed on, thankfully, good terms. And I did get to actually like say proper goodbyes to them and all that. And like we didn't end it on like a fight, thankfully. Woo. But I've been in a lot of relationships where, like, even just in terms of the relationship, I mean, because anything could happen the second that, like, you leave the space that you're sharing with somebody, right? Um, like you could die, they could die, whatever. Car accidents, obviously, that's a pretty big one. And what happened here, but like I've been in a lot of relationships. I've had times where I've come home and the person that I was, really close to completely moved out of the apartment that we shared for 2 years. That like there were a lot of things going on with them, and they couldn't kind of they decided that, like, oh well, they were going to take a break from things, and we ended up never getting back together. But the idea that somebody could be so kind of intimately into your life and then gone, for one way or another, like that transience of things, I think that's really like fundamentally a part of the human experience. And I think this emotional beat hits really well for me. Obviously, I've been in that kind of mode of thinking a lot about like what would be the last things that I say to a lot of these people that I really care about. And I've tried to be really conscious of that, even without thinking of this moment, like completely having forgotten this moment between Orihime and her brother. I've always been really conscious of maybe like the last things that I say to a person. Anytime that I hang out with friends, like I always tell them before I leave, I let them know, like, hey, stay safe out there, I love you, that kind of thing. And I think it's really important to tell your friends those sorts of things, and the people that you care about those sorts of things. At the very least, like, let them know, like, hey, man, have a nice day. I think that's incredibly important stuff, and that resonates with me pretty deeply. And so, talking about the kind of like emotional heart of Bleach, and where like Bleach really kind of has more going on than just being cool sword fights and characters fighting each other, I think that there's moments like this that really shine. Um, and I think part of why I wanted to reread Bleach is, you know, whenever I was reading through the entirety of it, it was years and years and years ago as it was being published. So I think I'm in kind of myself like a more experienced and more kind of traveled state, and I can bring a lot of that, my personal context to it, and maybe get a different reading out of it. And I think that's important. It's important to revisit the things that you enjoy, that you feel close to, that were formulative to you, especially. not just to reevaluate them in the ways that we're reevaluating these things, and putting them under analysis, and you know getting to engage with them again, enjoy them again, but also to kind of come at it from another angle. You've got this life lived that's going to give you a lot more insight into all these moments, and maybe things that completely didn't resonate with you, maybe now do. And I think certainly this moment does for me. Yeah, I've read this chapter so this is I think my third pass on this video, and every time reading through these lines, it's always gotten me very teared up. So yeah, especially going. I think Kubo does a fantastic job of keeping character detail kind of simple moving into this, especially as we're seeing these kind of completely whited out moments, real focus on the kind of connection between Orihime and her brother, right? And then we get that to where he's fading away, and we get this very very detailed drawing for Orihime where she's finally telling him to have a nice day, and then we get to see. I love this expression of Sora's. It's very heartfelt, and that he finally has this little smile and this moment of happiness before he passes. And I think that's sweet. I think that's really really tender and heartfelt. And then he's gone. Hopefully, like she said, gone to Soul Society. There we get the crescent moon again, as we do. Shows up a lot whenever hollows do, but punctuates this encounter for sure. Yeah, and then finally, yeah, clearly her wounds are mostly better, and we finally get that explanation for the memories being changed for Ichigo's family. Obviously, Rukia has this little device she can pull out, this Gyoku Chikan memory replacement, which ethically, I guess the idea is we can't let people know that there is this entire hidden, obviously we can't let people know about the afterlife and the existence of hollows because, right? One, because then this manga becomes entirely supernatural in nature, right? Completely shifts the focus of what's going on if it's not our assumed world where there's a hidden world, right? But also for maybe other reasons too. But the work that they do is secretive, mostly because it's not going to be seen by humans or perceived by them. So interesting that they have these contingencies too, for just in case, right? Also, it ends up being the memories are based on the whatever happens in their head. I'm interested to see, here Tatsuki kind of agrees, but I wonder how much of this is influenced by Orihime's active imagination. The whole Yakuza gunman scenario. Here we get some of the other female characters in Ichigo and Orihime's class. Characters we haven't seen yet before, but will be properly introduced as the series goes on. And they all have their variable personalities. Obviously, we get Chizuru, I think, is the one that's flirting a little, who's like, "Oh, you really are cute, princess." Notably, Orihime is Hime is like queen or princess, I believe. It's used to denote that. So I think that's where that nickname's coming from. That's not just kind of a flirtatious thing. Certainly it is, but it's also kind of just using the Hime part of Orihime's name. Yeah, I love that she defaults to Tatsuki. It's yeah, sure. And then everybody kind of freaks out because Tatsuki's maybe more the voice of reason, or Hime's always saying wild stuff. Yeah, and Ichigo immediately connects, yep, use that on my family. But I think that it worked out well is less maybe about his family, but more about hey, even though we were in this pretty drastic situation where people were pretty close to dying, it seems as though everything's worked out in the end here. And yeah, here we get a kind of sweet little moment in the collected volume where they're going to visit, assumably, Sora's grave. I think that's pretty nice, pretty sweet. Um, yeah, yeah. Anyway, man, that analysis ran pretty long for these episodes. This episode is longer than I thought it would end up being, but lots of really emotionally resonant stuff, a lot of really cool visual stuff going on in this chapter. I think it's a fantastic chapter. Let me get a little bit of water here, and we could talk about spoilers in the spoiler zone, connections to the manga writ large. So, if you're not looking for spoilers, if you're not looking for moments that connect to chapters we haven't read, get out of here. If that's what you're here for, you're in the right spot. So, talking about foreshadowing, things like that. Yeah, here we get, again, that hollow mentality, that sort of, this will line up, I think, a lot with the ways in which we get the despair that hollows feel, and like the ways that they kind of try to fill that despair, and like the twisted ways that they have thinking. I think it's interesting, Acid Ringer. I keep saying Acid Ringer, Acid Wire, because I think Ice Ringer is the later hollow that shows up slash a Rankar, I guess. But excuse me. Acid Wire is probably the hollow in this first arc that we get the most dialogue out of, right? That we certainly see the most kind of humanity from. And it's no surprise as his mask has been shattered to an extent. I don't think that really qualifies him as being an around car, right? Because I think the idea is that those, whenever they peel off their own mask and regain a bit of their identity, that there's something more there towards that transformation that involves like their own capability to kind of overcome that loss of identity that they get from being a hollow. So, here his mask has been fractured by Ichigo, so I don't think that really counts as him kind of, going through that process so much. But we do already get early signs that, behind the mask, obviously there is a human entity, twisted as it is, and that with less of the mask, more of that human entity comes out. Though certainly we see a lot of its twisting here through that hollow mindset. Yeah, and I like whenever the hollow masks give us the double teeth feature here with acid wires. It's kind of, it only dips down right there, but I love the teeth within the teeth whenever we do get that, the double jaw deal. Yeah, you know, more of this clash, but I kind of wanted to talk about also these swept clouds remind me a lot of the what is it? The Techno Life has that kind of going on, that look going on in the second intro for Bleach. I don't know if it's a reference specifically to this kind of chapter opening thing that Kubo's got, but where all the characters like wearing the white clothes. Maybe connection to the anime there. Titty Tromp, and won't be the first hollow to get in Orihime's business. Um, I made slight reference to it here, but as before in the previous chapter, there's this idea that Orihime has this sense of rejecting certain things, right? So here she wants to reject this sadness that she has, that she only wants to share this happiness, that she wants to like kind of hide this pain of hers, right? Ties into the power set she eventually gets, certainly, especially tied to, also the earrings as or I say earrings, the hairpins that will come up inevitably as how she manifests her powers are, full bring, since it is tied to an object. Um, yeah. Again, still not clear. We can talk about in the comments if it's a full bring or not. Though try to keep spoilers to a minimum for people who are reading this on a first read, please. But yeah, maybe I say all this like, yeah, maybe later on in the manga to this reread, I'll be able to really concretely pin down if it's a full bring. But like, I don't remember it ever explicitly getting stated. I remember Hachi saying her powers are strange, but that's neither here nor there. Um, but yeah, already we get, and this is fantastic kind of parallels to a lot of what's going on with Ulquiorra, right? That he has this intense loneliness and is also a black-haired hollow, which Orihime, ends up forming this bond with, right? And that the importance of their bond ends up being pretty core to both of their identities. Anyway, um, yeah, I mentioned, it's interesting that Rukia could still use Keto even with this week of a Ryatsu. Assumably, even though it's said that like Ichigo took all of her Soul Reaper powers, clearly she has some level of Ryatsu because one, she can still see, even though she's assumably in her Gigai, right? She could still perceive hollows, which means she hasn't been rendered entirely human. She's still a spiritual entity of some sort, right? Um, but then also she could still perform this keto, and I think that's proof of that, which I think is cool. Here we also get that first bit of healing keto. It's so easy to remember Rukia as doing like just shooting the blast keto. Maybe it's because of the anime, so used to that, right? But no, binding technique and here's some healing before she's ever blasted anything. But yeah, again, the earrings come up. Or I keep saying earrings. The hair pins. Ichigo's hand looking absolutely massive in this panel. Didn't mention that in the art, but big hands Ichigo. Yeah, I maybe I was almost close to talking a little bit too much about Masaki and those who die and those that get left behind and them feeling alone. Obviously, once you understand more of the everything but the rain or whatnot, all of that flashback, that ends up being pretty pertinent here. I think obviously we get a little bit more of that in the Substitute Shinigami arc with Grand Fisher and all of that, where Ichigo's really coming from here, outside of just being working in a clinic, as I had mentioned in the analysis. But the idea that there are those that die and those that get left behind, and both of them feel alone, and this kind of loneliness being resonant between both the people that pass on and those that get left is pretty significant for Ichigo's character. Especially the connection between entities that like pass on and those that are left, right? Because that's sort of kind of what happens with White, and the imprint that he has upon Ichigo. But then also with fucking Yawak, with the Quincy King and Ichigo too, to a degree, and Zangetsu as well. So kind of interesting. That like maybe obviously we're probably meant to read this line, in the moment as a line about kind of insight into Orihime and her brother, and maybe on a deeper level about Ichigo and his mother, or Ichigo and just kind of understanding the connection people have with death a little bit more and the grieving process. But also connects to a lot more of what's kind of going on with Ichigo and these connections that he has. Yeah. the idea of people getting left behind and loneliness, that's definitely recurring throughout Bleach for sure. Um, Even though, I mean, thinking about a lot of the other character deaths, I certainly think that ends up being true. I mean, thinking about Gin as well, and Rangiku, are thinking about Tosin and how the person that he loved after she passed on, that he had this kind of intense loneliness that he was dealing with, and that drove him towards the sort of justice that he was seeking. And whew, trying to think of some of the other character deaths and the other kind of ways that those affect the characters and how that loneliness that kind of grows from there. There was another one in Soul Society. Oh, of course, Bayekua, right? Kuchiki, and oh boy, Rugia's sister, whose name is not coming to me. Boy, oh wow. His fiance, and I guess even to an extent, Shunsway's as well, right? Anyway, there's this idea of something being left behind, especially this idea of like both of them feeling alone. Important stuff. Definitely gets repeated and explored in different ways. I think it's easy to forget how much Bleach is about death and about like the ways that it affects people whenever we're in the middle of like two characters shooting lasers at each other. you know but or like really cool Shikai or Bankai or whatever. But it's kind of interesting because there's a lot of that wrapped up in there and wrapped up in the characters' histories and their powers and everything. But yeah, I said it's a bit weird that he has his arms cut off. He regrows an arm just to do this stab. um Again, I think kind of one of the interesting moments is here that we do get the full mass shattering and him having this moment of sanity, but also this idea that he knows that he'll return to being hollow and not having full control over himself. I think that's the real indicator that he hasn't really ascended into being a Rancor, but instead there that he's accepting death instead, or I say death, but cleansing, right? So it's kind of interesting that he even though Ichigo, the idea is that typically the idea is they're cleansing them with actual slashing and sorting and cutting them down. Here, there's actually a moment of forgiveness and a moment of kind of rectifying, or I guess reconciling with the sins that he has committed, and turning over that other leaf, passing on, ends up being less conflict oriented here. Yeah. Again, the idea that Soul Reapers being intrinsically linked to Hollows, because certainly if we think about in the longer timeline of things, Hollows existed before Soul Reapers, right? That there was, man, this is really digging back deep into like early speculative Bleach lore. I say early, like early in the timeline, late as far as the manga goes. And I know Can't Fear Your Own World kind of makes a little bit of this more concrete, but again, I don't consider that 100% canon anyway. I'm just working from the framework of the manga here. But the idea that whenever all the realms were just one realm, or like before the Soul King was the linchpin of realities as he is now, that Hollow still existed then, right? That there was still this idea that human souls, or that souls in general, could be twisted into becoming hollows, and that Soul Reapers essentially, and that hollows like preyed upon, people, right? And so essentially the Soul Reaper caste grew out of a necessity to have some sort of militant force to stop hollows, right? That was the first Soul Reapers existed to do battle with hollows. And I think that's kind of interesting that the distinction isn't even made this early. Like, this is chapter 6, y'all. But like the whole thing of like Kanso and helping spirits move on to the afterlife, obviously that's important once the Soul Society is a separate realm entirely from the realm of the living. But whenever all the realms were as one, as it seems that was the case, and that's what ultimately the Quincy Lord Yahweh or Yahwak or Yuhabak, however you want to say that, that's his goal, is to bring it back to that singular reality. At least that seems to be the case, I'm pretty sure. So it's interesting that like here we already get a bit of a nod to that larger mythology. The Soul Reapers kind of exist in response to Hollows, and that's interesting. That we have affirmation of that right here already with Rukia. Kind of cool that that's that early on. I mean, obviously, it's not explicit that like the Kanso is a thing that came later, and that Soul Reapers aren't like just an entity like angels or something like that within mythology. Like they don't just exist. Like, hey, there's just a Soul Reaper that is just an extant mythological figure that's always been that way, but it's instead like a profession that a spirit has undertaken in order to specifically combat hollows. So yeah, it's interesting. Then we get into the idea of like, okay, well then they have to have a society that, is built around and structured around this militant organization, and that's how we end up with Soul Society existing as the way it does. It's really neat to think about, and it's cool again that that's literally like highlighted a little bit here. Obviously, in the just the most vague of ways. I mean, it's just that connection between Soul Reapers, Hollows, that Soul Reapers are a response to Hollows. But knowing the larger narrative, I'm glad that like this line in particular exists here this early as it does, because it just affirms that like so much of the mythology of Bleach, at the very least, like those basic things were thought out and stayed consistent throughout and weren't like retroactively written as much as they could have been. Because I certainly think that's the thing that a lot of mangaka do, to kind of make it seem as though they're doing the sort of cool foreshadowing a lot of people like to say, is that they go back and just read their early chapters and then go like, aha, I'll just build on that idea that I had earlier, and it'll seem like it was foreshadowing, right? So like, it's interesting that this holds true throughout, and that's evident in like a lot of aspects of Soul Society. Anyway, cool stuff. Get young Orihime. We get the start of the little hairpins. Yeah. Yeah, I think here, I mean, this is almost confirmation that I'm pretty sure it's a car wreck that kills him. Either that or, he was a Quincy and it was that fateful day. But no, the timeline wouldn't line up perfectly for that. No, it was a car wreck that got him, and yeah, I think the idea is that in the very beginning of this arc, he had saved her from getting hit by a car as well, right? Ergo the wound on her leg, that he wasn't trying to kill her, but he was trying to protect her. Again, making this kind of connection between a character fading into the white of the panel and Orihime having this kind of connection with them that's real heartfelt. We will certainly see that again with Ulquiorra. I think it's done well here. I think Ulquiorra certainly ends up being maybe, certainly the much more iconic of the two. That's for sure. But here I think it works really well this early in a manga. Not a lot of manga that I think within the first 6 chapters they have like a beat that hits me that well. Again, we get that an old Ichigo Crescent Hollows, maybe Hueco ass moon there, which is just recurring visual motif, really, if anything. Kind of interesting here is like she clearly still has the soul chain whenever she gets poofed. Next panel, it's not so clear. So I don't know what the deal is. Like as far as like getting her spirit back in her body, I suppose the idea is that that's just naturally going to happen. That after she wakes up from being unconscious, she'll be back in her body. Don't know. Um, I mentioned Ichigo's classmates. I seriously only remember Chizuru, but I'm pretty sure they all have all these girls have names. Bunch of designs that he just threw out there so that he could have some female characters that won't come up very much. But yeah. It's interesting how much Tatsuki is present early on. You really do get the sense that maybe Kubo wanted to do a little bit more with that character, and just it didn't end up happening. We certainly get more of her tied up in Orihime's next encounter with a Hollow as well. So we get more and more of those characters paired, but then, I guess Tatsuki just doesn't make the cut overall. Which, whenever you're trying to, I can understand if you're trying to keep your main cast a little slim, but then everything that happens in Soul Society happens, and then we get the whole flip of, hey, all those guys that were antagonists, they're all protagonists now. Like they've all joined the main cast. Here's a new set of antagonists for them to do battle with. So like the cast bloat really becomes huge, and then it becomes hard to focus on any one character's story, which is I think maybe one of the biggest balancing acts that Bleach tries to pull off, and in a lot of ways is successful, in a lot of ways it isn't. But I think, as much as it is easy to feel like maybe Tatsuki gets snuffed going forward, that she doesn't get like what she deserved, especially with how prominent she is kind of as an interesting early character. I think it just speaks maybe more towards Kubo developing those interesting characters. I mean, it's easy to remember, like, for every Tatsuki, there are, 3 other girls whose names I can't even remember, whose designs are so vague in my memory that I had to see them again to be like, oh yeah, those characters do exist, don't they, huh? There's girl with the mole, girl, the other cute one, uh, Chad, but a lady. I don't know. um, if these are some of your favorite female characters in Bleach, tell me the other way. Let me know who they are. Remind me. I certainly don't remember. Of course, I remember the raging lesbian character, but I think she's a little bit harder to forget. Also, I think she's more prominent in the anime too, which whenever I was originally watching Bleach, because that's kind of how I ingested it, right? Is that I read the first volume that came out in America around 2004, and then proceeded to watch the anime as it aired. And then once it got up to the Bound arc, I was like, I just need to read this manga weekly. And so I started reading the weekly scans on fan sites, right? So certainly I'm much more familiar with at least the first 3 seasons of the anime's depiction of a lot of these characters too. That's what I recall a lot whenever I think about early Bleach. So it's been fun to go back and actually reread it and refamiliarize with the manga, since it's been 16 years now, no, 18 years since my first read through of it. Yeah, it's been a long time. Been a while yet. But anyway, this video ended up much longer than I expected. Like I said, I originally had a much shorter cut of this, but the file didn't quite work out. And then I did another pass on it, and it was looking to be closer to maybe 50 minutes. And then I messed up the recording pretty significantly, and decided, screw it, I'll just go it from the top. And I thought to myself naively that perhaps having gone through the entire chapter twice, I could condense my thoughts more. But instead, the reality was I just found more things to talk about on top of what I already discussed. So, there you go. I could talk about a chapter of Bleach for over an hour straight, no problem. But for the rest of this, let's take it to the comments. If you have anything that you noticed, any insights that I didn't bring up, or if you want to discuss anything that I brought up in this video, feel free to leave it in the comments. Feel free to bring the discussion there. This video doesn't need to be any longer than it already is. Ideally, I want to aim for these videos being closer to the 30-minute mark than the 50-minute. Definitely the over an hour mark. I don't want that to be a common feature of these. But here we are again. Anyway, thanks for bearing with me. Thanks for watching through all of this. Hope the personal stuff wasn't too personal, but whenever we talk about, how we're going to connect to any sort of media, I think our personal context are very important. It's literally you're the person reading it, and that's what gives value to your reading of it. I mean, if personal context weren't important, then these videos would be less significant for that. And why would I even be uploading them other than as a project just to give me an excuse to reread everything, So I care about personal context and I care about what you think. So please leave a comment. Please let me know your thoughts on this chapter, your thoughts on the sort of analysis that I'm doing, as well as these larger connections I'm drawing, as well as any of those that you have of your own. As always, if you'd like to support me, any engagement on the video, like, shares, subscribe, whatever, comments, do all that. I've got a Twitter and a Patreon. You can follow or support me there as you like. But again, this has been Karakura Gold with Bleach Revisited. Thank you very much for getting through this humdinger. Is that even a word? This humdinger? Okay, move away from that. Thanks for getting through this long video with me. I really appreciate you watching through the entire thing, if you're still listening here. As always, never forget, the spirits are forever with you. Stay gold.